Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotist. Today I have David of the CVS podcast, which is not related to the pharmacy. It stands for Catholic Versus. I'll put a link to his podcast in the description as well, so you can go check it out. But I was on David's podcast about 2 weeks ago, and we had a very interesting discussion. He didn't know much about me, so he wanted to bring me on, learn about me. So I'm returning the favor now and allowing David to come on and tell his story. So how are you doing today, David?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm a huge fan, even though I haven't watched a lot of your content. What I've seen, I've just been very impressed, and so I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you. So maybe we could start off with, from what I remember from our discussion earlier, it seems like you weren't born Catholic, but you eventually came to the Catholic faith. So maybe if you wanted to just start off there and tell what you'd like of your story.
Sure, yeah. I've told it many times on my own podcast, but I'll just, I guess practice makes perfect, right? So I'll just try to give a brief overview. Basically, I was born into a loosely Protestant Christian home, sporadic church attendance. I guess the church attendance on Sunday was pretty consistent at certain points. And I loved it. I loved the Protestant church because that's all I knew. And I loved Sunday school. I loved the Bible stories. I loved everything about it. I even enjoyed praying at night. And I was born in 1970, so there was this sort of lingering Cold War thing, Russia, USA, superpowers with their nuclear powers and all these sorts of things. And so there were a lot of dreams, apocalyptic dreams of nuclear bombs going off, and they were always surprisingly peaceful because it was the end of the world. I saw the firebomb mushroom cloud, and it was just like almost like angels singing, like, yeah, this is the end of something sort of mediocre and the beginning of something better, like that's how I always viewed it in these dreams as a young child. But at the age of 14, I actually lost my faith in a counterintuitive way. I think I mentioned this to you, but I'll just repeat it anyway. I had a nice pleasant dream about Jesus Christ. He was on a desert island, a small cartoon island with one palm tree. And he's standing there looking at me peacefully, serenely, lovingly, and he just waved. And I guess it was sort of a I'll see you later wave, because I woke up and I had lost my faith in God and Jesus Christ. And I said, this is very counterintuitive to have a beautiful dream about my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, but it's over. And it just so happens that age 14 coincided with a very dark period, puberty, the hormones, the sexual frustration. I was wildly unpopular with the ladies. Still am today, and I'm happily married 26 years now, thank God. But dark period began, and then I was always interested in the truth. I think God guided me back to Him using philosophy. So I started right into what's it called? Logical positivism, A.J. Ayer. And I loved it. I mean, I just love, I'm a natural born rationalist. And it was a long journey, over 25 years from age 14 to 39. But I read a lot of philosophy sporadically, but especially at the end near my conversion. And it was, ironically, it was sort of the granddaddy of rationalism, René Descartes, that pulled me out of my hard solipsism, because that's where I sort of devolved into hard solipsism. And his discourse on method pulled me out of that. And I found God, and I was very happy to be a generic monotheist. And then it's just a 2-week journey from generic monotheist, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, generic monotheist, saying, well, I don't want to be Christian. I can't be Jewish, so I must be some sort of de facto Muslim or something, because I knew intuitively that I have to worship God publicly. This is not a private affair. The worship of God is not a private affair. So I said, well, I don't believe in Muhammad. I don't believe in the Quran, but whatever, I believe in their God. So I definitely don't believe in the Trinity. But it just so happened that a friend of mine, one of his tenants was killed tragically in a fire in one of his apartments, and there was this charred box of charred books that he presented to me. He said, I think you might find these books interesting, because my tenant who died was a religious fanatic. So there are all kinds of religious books in here. Go crazy. I know you've turned religious over the past couple of weeks. Here you go crazy. So I found amongst these books, I found the Confessions of St. Augustine, and I read it, and oh my God, I was on fire for Christ and his Catholic Church, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. So maybe we could dive into a few of those spots. I'm very curious how moving from positions you were saying of hard solipsism to Descartes. So how did you come across Descartes, and what arguments from Descartes did you find compelling?
Yeah. How did I discover Descartes? I discovered Descartes by starting with the pre-Socratics in the Western tradition and just doing an overview smattering of readings, whatever I found interesting in that long journey of Western tradition in philosophy. And there's a lot of Catholic content in there, right? Whether you like it or not, there is. And I didn't like it, but I mean, I absorbed all kinds of different wacky ideas from the pre-Socratics up to Descartes and everything in between. And I loved most of it. I would never have given credit to Jesus Christ or his church for any of the Catholic stuff or Christian stuff, but I just loved playing with ideas. So when I got chronologically moving up through, and my all-time favorite, of course, is Socrates and Plato, and I have a begrudging respect for Aristotle, but you know, there were some very interesting stops along the journey. Stoicism is mildly interesting, especially as an atheist. I think a lot of atheists can sympathize with Stoicism, with that eternal recurrence and that all-consuming fire that we're all destined for, to just, Groundhog Day, the Big Bang, Big Crunch, whatever way you want to phrase it. I think it's very appealing to the atheist, and there's that sort of existential thing that Nietzsche brought to the whole Stoicism. So it's an interesting journey going through the history of Western philosophy, and I'm a very sensitive type, so I was really carried along. When I got to the 18th century, is it, with the German idealists, I really got into that, and that really freaked me out a lot. That contributed quite a lot, as did Immanuel Kant, to my eventual fall right into the depths of not nihilism but hard solipsism, which is like nihilism 2.0. It's a much better place to be, but it's still not great. But when I read Discourse on Method, I can remember the exact moment that I lost my faith at age 14 when I woke up from that dream. I can also remember the exact moment I came back to my faith when I'm laying in bed in my bathroom, of all places, because we'd moved our bathroom in this large apartment. We moved our bedroom into the bathroom because it was too noisy up front, because all the drunks drinking on the main an intersection of two really popular streets for bars and for drinking. So I made like a loft bed in a very large bathroom when we were sleeping in there, and I was reading all my philosophy, and it just so happened to be René Descartes' Discourse on Method. And I was just laying there as an atheist reading I think, therefore I am. And it just suddenly occurred to me, because I was a hard solipsist at this point, it just suddenly occurred to me that being, this eternal being, this life eternal that I had been crushed by existentially as a hard solipsist, I was able to admit, I guess is the proper word, I was able to admit that I'm not God, that God is God. And René Descartes helped me with that just by the casual hand waving. It wasn't an argument. It was just a casual, well, of course we know that it's not evil demons fooling us. And of course we know that God is good. And of course, and that, for whatever reason, and, the atheists that I tell this to, they think, well, it's just an emotional experience. It's just anecdotal. This is just something you experience psychologically. And I always am ready to admit it might have been something that I ate that day. It might be a predisposition to mental illness. Who knows? God only knows, but I don't care. I was in a deep, 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 dark philosophical place, existential place with the hard solipsism. Reading Descartes allowed me to realize that I'm not God and that God is God. And that woke me up. And from that moment forward, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy. I'm so thankful to you, God, for creating me. I'm so thankful that you aren't punishing me for all my blasphemies and all my bad behavior and all my sins and these sorts of things. So it wasn't argumentation, it wasn't logic, it wasn't even philosophy. It's just this poor, heretical, crazy, some say demonic, demon-possessed man, René Descartes. I wouldn't go quite that far, but some really characterize him in a bad way, including Hugh Owen of the Colby Center. But I was very grateful to him just for pulling me out, and it's sort of like a damsel in distress scenario where I'm under the spell of the great dragon, and you never know what's going to wake you up and what's going to peel those scales from your eyes, right? So I hope that clarifies a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's like Balaam when he's hired by Balak to curse Israel. And no matter what Balaam tries to say, the only thing that can come out of his mouth are blessings, that God can use anything that's there. I know in my own conversion story, I think God used the writings of Bart Ehrman to get me interested in early Christianity and to try and help me understand what sort of the best atheist arguments are against the resurrection of Jesus, so that when I stumbled into the Christian sources, first of all, it's because of his writings, but also then I would be prepared to know that what I was reading on the Christian side, oh, that's not a straw man. I've already read the atheist side of this. So I think God can use that. Something when we look back, I think, on our own lives, we can see those moments where God gave us actual grace, right? The scholastics distinguish between actual and habitual grace. That actual grace is that moment where God pours grace into your heart, versus habitual grace is grace that's there from God acting within us then. And I think we had those moments in our life, right, where it seems like someone's acting from outside of us. And if we had read that one day before, it would have just gone right over us. But at that moment, God sort of opened us, brought us out of our death-like state, and allowed us to be able to believe. And even if then that wasn't the full supernatural virtue of faith, it's, I think, what the scholastics call the preparatory gifts, that God first gives us things that allow us, so when he finally does give us the virtue of faith, we can actually believe, because we otherwise wouldn't yet be disposed to it, right? It's like if you had a kid and you hand them like a calculus textbook. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful things they could learn from that calculus textbook. If they don't know addition, it's still not going to help them very much. And so,
Exactly. Well, I often think about God, my relationship with God, and with, you know, Jesus Christ and the church and the whole thing, in terms of the analogy of human romantic relationships. And of course, the reality, the ultimate reality, is in God and in the Trinity and in between God and his church and these sorts of things. That's the reality. And just as the Holy Family is the model, and the families here below hopefully are striving to imitate that model, but I think not so much today, not as much as I'd like anyway. But the romantic analogy is very powerful to me also in terms of what you were describing, where it's like there's this preparation, and we don't know why. Yesterday, if I'd read the same thing, it wouldn't have had that effect on me. It's the same thing when I met my wife-to-be. It's like I wasn't a philanderer. I wasn't, like I said, I'm not great with the ladies, but I'd had a couple of, I'd had 3 women in my life, and I liked women, and I'm attracted to women, but there's something special when I saw this woman that would be my wife. There was something special. And why did I see her walk by that day? And why was I attracted to her? It's a magical thing. We shouldn't question it too much. We should just appreciate it. We should thank God. And it was only 2 years later that I saw this woman again. I saw her walk by me once. I remarked, there's something about this woman. And I had to wait 2 years. Imagine, I had to wait 2 years to meet her. And she pursued me very aggressively, romantically. And within 3 months, we were married. So the Lord works in mysterious ways in every area of life. Do you agree?
yeah. Yeah, there's a Christ's parable of the pearl of great price, where the man he's searching for forever, buying lots of different things. And then he finds the one pearl he's been looking for, and he sells everything he has to get that one pearl. And we often complain, oh, why isn't it easier to find what's true? But I think we wouldn't value what's true unless it was difficult to discover that it was true, because it's going through that journey that makes us realize why it's important. And so we don't devalue it.
I think St. Augustine and perhaps St. Jerome said the same thing about the lack of perspicuity in the scriptures, right? It's just like there's an exercise here. It's intellectual, it's spiritual. There's a whole lot of stuff there to work us on many levels, and it's working our humility, and it's working all kinds of things. And so we get a lot out of that. I like to say to the atheist who frequently complains about the lack of perspicuity of the texts. I just say, well, it's part of the punishment for original sin. Like we're not in paradise anymore. Sorry to break the bad news to you, but we're not in paradise anymore, guys. So there's gonna be some confusion, and guess who we can blame for that? Not God, right? But the atheists want to blame God. They don't believe in God, but they want to blame God. Why is that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think a lot of the atheists, right, they have some sort of issue with God. And so God, for the sake of their soul, allows them to not believe in the existence of God, right? Because some atheists say, oh, why doesn't God reveal himself to me? And yes, well, if God did exist, what would you do? And they'd say, oh, I'd be mad and I'd curse God and I'd say this and that to him and say, all right, maybe it's better for your soul that you're not doing that. So God allows you to just simply think he doesn't exist, so you don't try and do all of that.
Yeah, what I like to say, that's a good point, but what I like to say also to the atheist who says, well, I know God could have letters in the sky formed by this constellations saying God is real and all this sort of thing. And I just say, yeah, but hey, I'm a messenger of God. God has a message for you right now, and I'm the messenger of God, and I'm telling you, God is real, God loves you, God wants you to choose wisely, choose life now. And they're just like, oh, you're just being silly, you're just being theatrical. No, I mean, I'm serious. Like, this is actually happening right now. I'm here in the flesh telling you, right? Oh, no, well, we need someone to come back from the dead. And then I quote, with the guy who died, Lazarus, and the rich guy that died, and I quote that parable to them. But, like you said, it's just that magic moment when things have been prepared by God, and then click, boom, it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, another part of your journey you mentioned is initially you became a Muslim, and you said it was mostly because you couldn't accept Judaism or Christianity. But was there anything specific about Islam that attracted you to it initially?
Yeah, just the fervor of the televangelists that I was watching. Zakir Naik, I really like him. A lot of people don't like him. I like him. He was fanatical. He's like, yes, I'm fanatical. I'm fanatical for virtue. I'm fanatical for peace. I'm fanatical for justice. And I like that fervor for all the virtues and all the pure perfections of God that the Muslims were preaching. And I didn't agree with everything. Obviously, I had no basis to believe Muhammad was anything other than just a charlatan, right? But I've always kind of secretly held Islam as my number 2 favorite religion, ahead of the Orthodox faith, the Protestant faiths, and the Judaism and all its forms. I just secretly like Islam because it's pure and it's, somewhat fanatical in that way. This is not to disparage anyone that I just put behind Islam, and it's also a little bit of a goad. Like, I am kind of joking a little bit because obviously there's so little separating us from some of the Orthodox churches that, it's like I would have to, if forced, I would have to put some of these Orthodox churches in second place, right? But I always say, and it's not a joke at all, I always say that I don't have a plan B. My plan B is generic monotheism. I will never become Orthodox. I will never become Protestant. I will never become Jewish. I will never become Muslim. I will never become any religion whatsoever. If the church contradicts itself, and I come to believe that, then I will just go back to generic monotheism. And I give that 0.000, as many zeros as you want, probability of ever happening, because it's just any question I've ever had about the faith, the church has always got the answer. Now, is it easy to always find the answer? Not always. This week, as you may know, I was concerned about that apparent contradiction between two dogmas, and we can talk about that later if you're interested, once you've exhausted the biographical side.
Yeah, so I was wondering a little bit about, did you actually start practicing Islam? So were you attending a mosque and so on? Okay, interesting.
No.
Yeah, how long were you interested in Islam, at least then?
Oh, I was, what you need to understand about my journey is that I was an enemy of Christ and his church, but I was warming up to the idea of God. I'd been chewing, thanks to St. Anselm, mostly, because I'd been chewing on the, what's it called? Ontological argument?
Yeah.
I've been chewing on that as an atheist for 8 solid years. Imagine an atheist chewing on that ever since I read it, just like in the back of my mind. What does it mean? What could it mean? What does it mean? How can we understand this? Just like I always compare it to a koan or whatever that they use in the East. Just an absurd puzzle to occupy the mind, and you're kind of tickled by it because you think you grabbed it and it slips away and turns on you. And it's just, to this day, it's kind of like that for me. I'd love to discuss it with you and sort of get on more solid footing, because as a believer, I'm very comfortable with it, but I'd like to sharpen it up when I talk with non-believers, if that's possible. I think you've expressed that that's not really a viable option anyway. So
yeah, because I think it's an argument that's true, but you hear it, you go, that can't be true. But it's really, you can't find any objections to it. But it just sounds on the surface like that shouldn't work. But there's nothing that actually works against it, especially once you understand it properly, because there's sort of the easy objection of, oh, well, can't you have the maximally great island, until you realize that that doesn't actually work, because we're discussing something that's finite. And so you could always add another palm tree to that island, but you can't come up with a maximally great being.
It's funny you mention that. It's funny you mention that, because my dream where Jesus said au revoir, he was standing on a desert island with exactly one palm tree. Less is more. Less is more, right? Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's sometimes be a certain fittingness to it being less, right? Because then there can be an overabundance of it, but that's because we're dealing with just finite things, right? When we start dealing with infinite, you made that earlier point about God's pure perfections, right? That God, he doesn't have perfections in the same way we do, these same limited perfections. He has pure perfections, and we have some of those too, but we don't have them to the infinite degree that God has.
We participate in them, yeah.
Yeah.
I always say, the example I always use for the pure perfections as a counterexample is that a circle is perfect, but God is not a circle. Why? Because it's not better to be a circle.
Yeah.
If it were better to be a circle, yeah, okay, God would be a circle. But it's like, this is not rocket science. I mean, that's the thing I love about Christ and his church. It's like, just like when you read the Gospels and the Jews come up with a really fancy trick question, and then he just pierces through it with common sense, right? And that's what we're really missing today. Christians and non-Christians alike, we're missing that ability to cut through. And as the late great Archbishop Fulton Sheen famously said, that's what humor is. God is the ultimate humorist because he sees through. That's what humor is. It sees through all the petty stuff and all the misunderstandings and all the ambiguity, and it sees through all that and is aware of all that, but cuts right to the essence. And that's why it's funny, because it astonishes us, right? Like what's that word, thavmasi or thavmasio or something like that in the Bible and New Testament Greek, when he talks about when Jesus is constantly astonishing his hearers. They even tried to arrest him, but they couldn't, because he was so funny, right? He was so powerful. He just said stuff and it just like blew their minds, right?
Yeah. Yeah, on that, I sort of have, I think, two related points. Your first one about just the common sense. And sometimes in academia, it can be so easy to get into wanting to find the complicated answer that you miss the simple answer right in front of you. And there's a great example of this from, I think, probably my favorite biblical theologian ever, James Jordan. I've learned so much from James Jordan. And he said one of the best insights he ever got is he was doing a Bible study at his church. He's a Presbyterian. And he was giving a talk on the fall. And afterwards, a little girl comes up to him and goes, the snake eats the dust, right? And he goes, yeah. And Adam's made of dust. He goes, oh, wait a second. Yeah, he'd been doing this, had gotten his PhD in it, had been reading like the Bible for like decades now, and hadn't noticed that the snake eats what Adam is made of in the chapter before.
Wow.
And yeah. And it's sometimes those simple insights you can get, and you go, oh, everything makes a lot more sense now.
Wow. So what are some of the insights you got from that? Because I'm just impacted by it right away without seeing what it might mean.
Yeah, I think it shows that, right, there's a lot of people saying, oh, well, the passage about like that snakes used to walk on four legs and then they switched to not having any legs. No, that's not what the story is about. And the word for serpent there in Hebrew can actually mean like shining one or bright one, and snakes are frequently connected with angels in the Bible. And we actually see this on the little bit of ancient Israelite imagery we have. We have some coins, or not coins, rather seals from a few different Israelite kings, and they usually have cherubim or seraphim on there.
Wow.
And the cherubim and seraphim, they're not depicted like we do in iconography now, but are actually depicted as serpents with wings on them.
Wow.
That the Israelites envisioned angelic, especially the higher levels of angels, as serpentine beings. So that's clearly the case here. It's a serpentine angelic being that Satan is here, not a just ordinary snake. And there's other clues there as well. Like, for example, when the serpent is introduced, it's usually translated in most Bibles as the serpent was wiser than any other beast of the field. The word other isn't there in the Hebrew. It just says the serpent is wiser than any beast of the field. So clearly the serpent is not identified as among the beasts of the field. But I think this just adds yet another detail there. The question is if it is a symbol, the snake is a symbol and not a literal snake, then why is it that he's said to now have to walk on this belly and eat dust? Well, that's because it's a symbol of demons going after humans and trying to eat the souls of demons, right? And if we're, the question is, yeah. And I think the question is, are we going to end up in the body of Christ or in the body of Satan?
Wow.
Because the body of Satan we see, right? When we see what's cast into the lake of fire, in Book of Revelation, I think if I remember correctly, we only see the dragon thrown in, right? But I think that all the damned are in the body of Satan rather than being in the body of Christ. So they're all cast into that same lake of fire with the serpent.
Wow, amazing. I often meditate on the image that St. Anselm uses in at least one of his meditations. If you haven't read the meditations, you should go and read. I'm speaking to your audience now. If you haven't read the meditations of St. Anselm, go and read them right away. But do you remember the meditation where he's talking about crossing a blind, crippled man, crossing that rope ladder across the chasm? And do you remember that?
I actually haven't read his meditations. I need to go do that.
Yeah. Stop the podcast, go read it. But no, it's amazing. It's amazing. I'm sure you'll love it. It's so devotional. It's like, it's, you know, I feel a little bit bad because my first love was St. Augustine, but then I sort of feel like I love St. Anselm more. But I guess it's like your children. You don't pick favorites, right? You just love them all for what they contribute. But they do call him the second St. Augustine, right? So.
Yeah.
But anyway, he talks often about the gaping maw, like the jaws of hell, like it's a creature, and he's dangling by a thread above this gaping mouth of hell, and he's very, very acutely aware of the danger that he's in spiritually. And I like it when he says, he says unironically, I'm not feigning this. I'm being sincere. Like, I really do believe this, that I am on the edge of the precipice of hell. So he's very, you know, obviously he's very devout and pious and he loves God, but he's drilling home to people like us, regular folk, that even the saints are this close to perdition. And where does it say in the Bible that you know, even the saints, does St. Paul say that? Like, even if it's hard for the saints to enter heaven, how is it going to be for us? Or what's that passage?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact one. I think I remember there is something in there like that. But yeah,
something like that. I remember Scott Hahn did a good job of bringing that home when he talked about Joseph and going into Egypt and all his troubles in Egypt, but then when Potiphar's wife wanted him sexually or whatever, she grabbed his garment and he escaped. And Scott Hahn does a nice job of painting a picture where, I think it was, or it might have been Peter Kraft, where it's just like all of salvation escaped like by a thread, because it was literally like the threads of his garment as he escaped. And that's making me think again now of the garden when they captured Jesus. Wasn't there a similar story? Didn't someone run off and the guard had his clothing and he ran off nude or something? Isn't there something like that in the garden?
I don't remember. I have to go reread. Yeah.
But anyway, there's this idea that like even the heroes of the faith in salvation history, they have these narrow escapes, and we often hear about the remnant of the Jewish people, and, you know, of course, the younger son usurping the privileges of the elder son, these sorts of things. They're common themes. And another thing I wanted to talk about with you when you feel it's appropriate is the covenants. Scott Hahn does a good job of talking about the covenants, and I was thinking about that today. I could only remember 6 covenants. I'm pretty sure there must be 7. It seems to me there's 7. Can you take a stab at it?
Yeah, so I think that there's 6 that are widely recognized, but James Jordan has pointed out, I think it's a 7th that people overlook, because we have the initial Adamic covenant.
Yep.
Then we have the Noachic covenant.
Yep.
Then we have the Abrahamic covenant.
Yep.
The Mosaic covenant.
Yep.
The Davidic covenant.
Yep.
And then usually people jump from the Davidic covenant to the New Covenant. But there's actually another covenant that most people miss there in between the two, which is the Restoration Covenant, when Ezra comes and renews the covenant. And actually, it's even before Ezra, about 2 Persian kings before Ezra, because he's in Artaxerxes. But in the reign of Darius, there's already the beginning of that when they rebuild the temple. And Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the governor, go to rebuild the temple. But there's an issue that Joshua is ritually impure. But you cannot.
This is Joshua, son of Nun, the same famous guy?
No, this is a different Joshua. Okay. This is Joshua, the high priest, in the reign of King Darius. But the priesthood has been in exile. Joshua is the high priest, but he cannot rebuild the temple until he becomes ritually pure. But there's a problem. He needs the temple in order to go through the proper rituals laid out in the book of Leviticus to become ritually pure. So what's going to happen? And actually, the prophet Zechariah is around at this time. Okay. And we see in the vision of the prophet Zechariah that he has a series of 8 night visions. And I think it's in the 3rd one that he sees Michael the archangel and Satan debating over Joshua standing there. And Satan's on one side and St. Michael is on the other. And St. Michael says to Satan, I think it's the Lord rebuke you. And then he goes and brings clean garments, if I remember correctly. I'm patrolling from memory. I might be misremembering some of the details, but he goes and takes clean garments and gives them and puts them on Joshua in this vision. And then afterwards, Zechariah comes to Joshua and tells him this vision so that Joshua now knows he is ritually clean to serve as the high priest so they can begin the rebuilding of the temple.
Wow.
And then we see in Ezra that people had at this time forgotten the law. And also most of the Jews had begun to speak Aramaic and had forgotten Hebrew. Very few people at this time knew Hebrew. And so Ezra had to go and get the law and read the law to the people again, and had to take a new census of the people, and he had to translate for them the law into Aramaic as he's reading it. We actually see this as a tradition before even the Septuagint of something called the Targums, which are not word-for-word translations of Old Testament books. They are theological paraphrases of Old Testament books. They might at points be pretty much line for line, and at other points things are significantly changed. They're an interesting window into the theology of Jews before the time of Jesus. And also shortly after, I think this tradition continues. And so I think it's this restoration covenant we're seeing. We also see lots of other things connected to it. So evangelism becomes important, that the Jews, for the most part, before the fall of Jerusalem, did not do much evangelism. They do nationwide evangelism sometimes, right? So Elijah goes to anoint the king of Syria, or Jonah who goes to Nineveh. But there's no attempt to evangelize random people in other nations. But we actually see Jewish missionaries now traveling all throughout the Persian, Greek, and Roman empires going to convert people. And people miss this a little bit, but it's mentioned in the Gospels because this whole project had become corrupted by the time of Jesus. Because Jesus says to the Pharisees, you travel over land and sea to make one convert, and you make them twice the son of hell, right? That they've done it, but then they're teaching them false teachings, and they're actually just making them worse off from when they were ignorant of the scriptures in the first place. Wow. And so we're seeing that there's a significant change in how the covenant is structured and what's going on after the exile, that I think this should really be considered another covenant. I think Daniel's also important to setting up this covenant, where Daniel has this vision of the 4 empires in the 490 years that I think was meant to be a framework, because it would be after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And recently I discovered that there actually is good arguments for Joel being from the post-exilic period too. That's very, very heavily debated. But we really have 3 major prophets working then, Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. And besides that, they don't have any prophets coming. And after they die off, there's no more prophets for a long time. There's wisdom literature and there's history, but they have no prophets. So I think the book of Daniel is sort of given as to keep in hope and remain and point forward towards what was to come. And so I think there is this restoration covenant. There's also sort of mini covenants that exist between the covenants, right? So we have between
What about Melchizedek? Is he in the covenant thing?
yeah, I think he's connected with the initiation of the Abrahamic covenant, even if he himself is living under the Noachic covenant. Because during the Abrahamic through restoration covenants, well, the Jews are living under those. The Gentiles continue under the Noachic covenant until the new covenant, and even when they were a convert, right? So that you could become a convert and actually convert and be received into the people of Israel. Or you could simply be a Gentile believer. That was an acceptable position if you weren't born as an Israelite. And we see this quite frequently. So it seems lots and lots of the Persians were Gentile believers. It seems that when you go around in the book of Acts, you notice most of the Gentiles they go to aren't pagans in the book of Acts. Most of them are Gentile believers already, right? So you go, for example, to the Ethiopian eunuch. He wasn't a practicing Jew because he wasn't Jewish, but he was reading the book of Isaiah. He was quite interested in this. And so there seems to be a status that it's okay to essentially be a non-idolatrous monotheist following natural law and so on.
Samaritans, for example?
I think the Samaritans are under the covenant with Israel, but they're descended from the northern kingdom, even if they were mixed in with quite a bit of idolatry as well.
They were heavily shunned just because it's infighting in a closely knit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're still there, but they had edited the scriptures to have lots of false information in it.
Oh.
So if you look in their 10 commandments, there's an additional commandment to build an altar on Mount Gerizim, so that they can have that one separate from it. But what is really interesting is that if they had their own independent scriptural tradition, this probably came from before the period of the exile. So this creates a huge issue for biblical scholars because they want to say the Pentateuch was finished in around 400 or 300. Well, if it's finished in 400, but the Samaritans were clearly a distinct separate group that would have had to have this distinct Pentateuch by the 7th century. I would really say, I think this is formed shortly after the schism. So probably somewhere in the 900s BC, right? This creates a significant issue for the documentary hypothesis that actually the Pentateuch was just made up later.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of nonsense speculation. It's motivated, consciously or unconsciously motivated by hatred of organized religion or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking about all that wonderful stuff about the fact that Joshua, who you mentioned, who's obviously a lot later in history than Joshua, son of Nun or whatever, but I was thinking about his name means Jesus. It's the same. It's the same as Jesus. Yeah. Same name, right?
Yeah, and this is you're having a vision, right, of Michael and Satan debating over a Jesus the high priest.
Wow. Wild, very wild stuff. What about that naphtha, the fire water stuff? Naphtha.
I don't know about that.
They said that the fire was supposed to keep burning, and they didn't find water. They didn't find fire, but they found this water, and when they brought the water into the sun, it ignited, and they called it naphtha.
Okay, where is this from?
I can Google it.
Yeah.
Old Testament.
Okay, yeah, I don't remember this story.
Nah, sounds like something you'd like to learn the history of.
Yeah.
Because you would have, it's got some scholarly interest.
Yeah, how do you spell that?
Naphtha. Is it in?
Interesting.
Is it in the Maccabees?
Maybe it's in the Maccabees. All right, yeah. Oh yeah, it's in the book of 2nd Maccabees. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. So it's actually the event took place at the time of Nehemiah, but it's mentioned in 2nd Maccabees. But 2nd Maccabees is actually very useful in that it records a lot of oral traditions that were not in the initial canonical Old Testament. Essentially, I think the 22 book canon, which is 39 in our Bibles, that was preserved by the Jews and then was returned to as just strictly that by Protestants. St. John of Damascus says that those 22 books, or 24 books rather, were deposited within the Holy of Holies there. And so I think that there's other books that I think are canonical, of course, were not deposited there. And that's why we call them Deuterocanon, a secondary canon that was written down during this time once the proto-canon was deposited within the Holy of Holies.
You know, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but Second Maccabees is very useful in that it records lots of these oral traditions of important details that I really think that book needs to be studied to give us important information. Like one story that I noticed is Jeremiah within it hides the Ark of the Covenant. Here, actually, I'm going to pull up my Bible here and read this story because it's quite, and then I'll read where I think the New Testament fulfillment of it is.
Yeah.
All right, so this is in Second Maccabees.
I love Second Maccabees. I love how he introduces it and how he ends it. It's like there are plenty of books that do a better job than I'm doing, but you know, I'm just doing a summary here. You know, what do you make of that?
No, I think I haven't thought about that introduction very much, but I think that's the case that there is. But at this time, there are no prophets coming. So I think, right, if you look in First Maccabees, they're genuinely not sure about how to deal with the situation of the high priesthood having apostatized. And a lot of biblical scholars think that they essentially screwed up by trying to make themselves the kings and the high priest after that, because they were not authorized by God to do that, right? Because in the time of Joshua, as we were mentioning earlier, right, he goes, all right, I'm not sure what to do with this. And then God sends a sign from heaven and clarifies what to do. But the Maccabees just went ahead and made themselves the high priests. And that means you could do every holiday on the liturgical calendar, right? Except the feast of the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was the only feast day where you needed the high priest to perform it. And it's interesting, that's the one feast day that we never see Jesus participating within in the New Testament. So perhaps, because I think there's a lot of people who think Jesus was associated with the Essenes, and I don't think that's the case. I think the Essenes were essentially a sort of schismatic group, and Jesus never talks about them in the New Testament because they weren't important to history.
Have you heard some people say that St. John the Baptist was an Essene too?
Yeah, I think there's similarities going around, but I don't think he's part of the Qumran community, because I think Jesus, by participating within the temple, and John the Baptist participating within the temple, I mean, his father was a priest, shows that they rejected the Essene, at least the Qumran. We don't know all the Essenes were the same, but at least the Qumran community position of rejecting the temple authority altogether. But I think Jesus put some brakes on that by not participating within the Day of Atonement, because, I mean, at least we don't know if he did. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But it's interesting that it's omitted. And that was one feast day that seems like it might have been invalid according to the way they were celebrating it that day. And actually, by the time of the Romans, the high priesthood wasn't even the Maccabees anymore. It was a appointed position by the Romans, and they changed every year, right? We flip to the New Testament, and you'll read like so-and-so was high priest that year. And that should immediately send up alarm bells. High priest that year? High priest serves for life. Why is there a high priest that year?
What about the fact that Jesus said that we should obey those who sit in the seat of Moses? What is the seat of Moses? And like, was that compromised?
Yeah, no, I think the seat of Moses there is referring to the continuation of the 70 elders of the Sanhedrin, which was a distinct teaching authority of, and especially I think a civil authority of elders, right? These were the people who God had appointed. And there's 70 of them. There's 70 people in the, and if you go to the table of nations and count the number of different nations in the world there, or at least symbolically, it's 70. So 70 represents the number. Israel represents the whole world. So there's 70 elders appointed by Moses. And then they go to Mount Sinai, and the Spirit descends upon them, and they prophesy. So they have a sort of Pentecost by which they're appointed there, and they also have a meal. So it's a sort of type of the Eucharist there that they then celebrate. And then Moses sends them out as sort of an authority to deal with issues there. And so I think Jesus is affirming here, yeah, the Sanhedrin is still the continuation of the elders at that time. And we saw that the elders seem to have been an appointed position. They were appointed by Moses. So that seems like there was no divine law about how they were selected. So you could change that throughout history. So I think Jesus is fine with their existence. It's just what they're doing is problematic. Be the one to read the section from here, from Second Maccabees 2. One finds in the record that Jeremiah the prophet ordered those who were being deported to take some fire, as has been told, in that the prophet, after giving them the law, instructed those who were being deported not to forget the commandments of the Lord, nor to be led astray in their thoughts upon seeing the gold and silver statues in their adornment. With other similar words, he exhorted them that the law should not depart from their hearts. It was also in the writing that the prophet, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent in the ark should follow with him, and that he went up to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had the inheritance of God. And Jeremiah came and found a cave, and he brought there the tent in the ark and the altar of incense, and sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed after him came to mark the way, but could not find it. When Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, "The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy." All right. So we have here, so we flip back to what was going on in the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is prophesying against the house of David because they're becoming idolatrous. And they were essentially, and Jeremiah's whole message is, look, basically, you're idolatrous. God is now going to take the side of the Babylonians, and you are going to be subject to Babylon for 70 years. And Jeremiah actually tells people, don't take up arms, don't fight. It's a pointless fight. You're going to lose. Submit to Babylon. The sooner you submit to Babylon, the sooner God is going to use it to purify you, and the sooner you're going to get out of this whole predicament. And Jeremiah is called a traitor. He's imprisoned at one point for this. And a lot of people read this just in the context of Jeremiah. Now, the book of Jeremiah, in terms of its chronology, is a giant mess because it's all out of chronological order. Different manuscripts have actually different chronological markers. So I think it's kind of a waste of time trying to figure out the chronology of Jeremiah, because I tried reading multiple commentaries on it, and none of them could figure it out either. So I don't know how this lines up with the chronology of Ezekiel, but we should remember Jeremiah was a priest, and he was a priest in in Jerusalem, right? And he's preaching. He spends his entire ministry in Jerusalem until near the end of his life, where he goes off to Egypt. And Jeremiah is telling people actually to flee from Jerusalem to Babylon and submit to Babylon. Now, Jeremiah, if he was a priest and one of the few good priests, we see most of the priests at this time are corrupt. He must have been good friends with the other good priests there. And one of those we know of is Ezekiel. And Ezekiel goes off. He's taken away. There's 2 deportations to Babylon. And in the first one, when Nebuchadnezzar first comes up and he takes away a number of captives, and among those are Ezekiel and Daniel. And so those were both good men. They must have known Jeremiah. Actually, Ezekiel mentions Daniel as one of the most righteous men who have ever lived. He lists Noah, Job, and Daniel as the 3 most righteous men ever to have lived.
Repeatedly, yes.
This creates a huge issue for textual scholars who want to say that Daniel was written hundreds of years later. And actually, they claim this is about a totally unrelated Ugaritic hero named Daniel. But if you go read that, the Daniel in that story is an idolater. And also, we have no evidence that Daniel's story was actually known about the day of Ezekiel. The Ugaritic texts come from like nearly 1,000 years before that. But anyways, Ezekiel goes, and Ezekiel has a vision that the chariot of God gets up from the temple and leaves the temple. And so I think Ezekiel at this point, right, I think he probably sends a letter back to Jeremiah going, look, what we've known is going to happen for a long time has now happened. The temple has been abandoned. And so I think it's not recorded there in Jeremiah. It's not recorded in Jeremiah, but in 2nd Maccabees, it tells us that I think what Jeremiah did is he went and he took the tabernacle and went and hid it. And he says specifically, I'll read it again here. The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. So this we would think is immediately after the exile. We know from the book of Daniel that the exile never really ended. And after the rebuilding of Jerusalem, there would be another 490-year period before the Messiah comes and truly reestablishes the kingdom of Israel. So I think actually one of the major themes in the New Testament is Jesus is the one who enacts the new return from exile. and brings the people truly out of Babylon and into the new covenant. So it should be at this point that we see the new Ark of the Covenant. And I think this is prophesying Mary as
Yeah.
the new Ark of the Covenant. And I think Revelation is actually alluding to Second Maccabees there in Revelation chapter 11, or we read at the very end of it. Then the temple of God in heaven was opened, and the Ark of the Covenant was seen within the temple. And there were flashes of lightning, loud noises, pearl of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth, in anguish for delivery. So I think that this is a prophecy Jeremiah is pointing forward to. There's going to be a new Ark of the Covenant. And what do we see in both, I think, the Gospel of Luke and then again in Revelation, is there is the new Ark of the Covenant has returned, and it's Our Lady.
Yeah, when I'm listening to my Protestant radio station as I drive around at work, they're always very eager to point out that the woman in Revelation is not the church. It's not the church. It's not the church. It's not the church. And it's not Mary. It's not Mary. It's not Mary. It's not Mary. It's not the church. They're very, very anxious to dissuade people from connecting the dots, right? Like, it's just sort of natural. It's kind of natural to connect those dots, right? So it takes a lot of effort to keep people down from what's natural.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe we could get into, you had mentioned you've been doing some research recently into two dogmas that to the face of it could seem contradictory. So I was wondering if you maybe want to share that and what you've been discovering in your research. Yeah.
And then I want your insights because I'm really curious what you think. And it ties in with everything that I'm interested in, you know, with essence, substance, and you have the Orthodox and the Catholic perspective on these different sort of terms and how they get mixed up in these sorts of things, substance and accident and all these sorts of things. So it has to do with the two dogmas, one of which is that all add extra activities are common to all three persons of the Trinity. Ad extra just means outside of the Trinity and creation, I guess. And the second dogma that I see an apparent, and I know it's only an apparent contradiction, I'm not worried about it, but it's just interesting, is that only the second person incarnated, only the second person of the Trinity took on flesh. I've since discovered that it is the Catholic understanding, and it's just because I haven't memorized this book, but I've gone through it a couple of times. But I looked it up, and it is Catholic teaching that all three persons did the incarnation. But what they did is they did an incarnation of the second person. And St. Anselm apparently unpacks this with John Rosselin, or whatever his name is. Do you know about him?
I don't, yeah.
No, you don't know.
Maybe you want to go into this whole controversy a little bit. That'd be good.
Well, I'm a baby. I'm like baby steps here. I'm just starting to look into it. I got an academic document on it. I started reading it last night. I got about 20% in. It's very interesting. It was poorly written. I think it was translated from some other language into English. It's just really poorly written. But there's citations from Anselm and this guy, John Rosselin, who is a nominalist. Actually, he's right up there with William of Ockham for being like the top dog of nominalism. And so he's a bad guy in my books. But the basic argument, the crux of the argument has to do with what is a person, what is a substance, what is essence, what is unity, what is numerical unity, what is a relative. What does Anselm say? Anselm's got all these formal things, relative things, and he's got all sorts of subtle distinctions that you know more about than I do. You know, at least academically, I think you've got a better grip on it than I have when it comes to these distinctions that Anselm's able to make, which I'm just sort of like, okay, I'll have to look into that. I'll have to look into this, and I'll have to look into that. But what's your impression?
Yeah, Anselm can be a little bit weird to read sometimes because he's often making up his own words to describe these things. But his words are very important. I think that actually him taking a step back actually is a huge step forward in philosophy, in that he's able, I think, to get very new insights. And I think they aren't necessarily new insights, but new approaches to those existing issues there. As you were saying, with all these distinctions that St. John of Damascus, he's dealing with sort of the end of the Christological controversies. Right? He's looking back at about 400 years in Byzantine history, Christological controversy, starting with Arius and going all the way through to monothelitism. And you realize that the common theme in them is that they confuse the relationship of nature and person. And once you miss that whole point, everything else falls apart, unless you can properly distinguish nature and person. And I think that that really is probably going on here too, right? There's the divine nature acting in the incarnation, all three persons doing that, but now there being a human nature that has a relationship to the second person of the Trinity. But again, there we also want to distinguish that it's not the second person who comes to have a relation with the human nature, but the human nature that comes to have a relation with the second person, because God does not change, but the human nature can change with respect to the second person.
That's exactly what Anselm said. It's exactly what he said, just like that. So did you read that, or is that just you intuiting?
No, I'm just drawing on other stuff there, yeah.
Okay. I read something today, just briefly, while at work, on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I don't know how well reputed it is in Christian circles, but in any case, I was just curious. An article about the Trinity, and of course Anselm's in there along with St. Augustine and others. But I read something, I'll have to reread it. I got the impression I got from this article, and I don't think it's a Catholic article, but the impression I got was that St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, St. Augustine, all these big hitters, I think he threw in some other names, like household names in, scholastic and just Catholic philosophy generally, they were pushing a certain view of the Trinity, which is not actually the most supported argument today in theological circles. Now, I could interpret that one of two ways, because I'm very skeptical of modern, academia and scholarship, theology. It doesn't mean much to me. So is it just like the stupid quote unquote stupid theologians today don't agree with these geniuses, or is it that actually that we've sort of corrected some of the missteps that were taken by these great geniuses, because they're only human and they're not perfect, right?
No, I think it's that what's become very popular today is to defend something called social Trinitarianism, which essentially, it's sort of basically a denial of monotheism. It sort of posits that what the unity in the Trinity is a sort of moral unity, rather than they'll say there's one, they'll affirm the Nicene Creed, but what they mean by person in it is not what the church fathers meant by person, right? They were saying essentially that there is one divine essence that exists in three different modes that are distinguished by relation.
But that's not modalism then?
No, that's not modalism. We're not saying that it's the same person existing three different ways.
Okay.
We're saying it's the same divine essence that exists in a fatherly way, a filial way, and in a preceded way of the Holy Spirit.
It's okay to use the word mode, like those are three modes?
Yeah, you could. It's the language we use. Right, we have to ask the question, what do we mean by that language? So absolutely, the language of mode could very easily slip into modalism. So we don't want to say it's that sometimes he's the Father, sometimes the Son, sometimes the Spirit. No, we're saying that it's one divine essence that exists essentially in three persons. Versus what they want to say, essentially, the theistic personalists want to say, is that there's three distinct psychological centers of consciousness. Versus the church fathers saying there's one singular intellect and will proper to that divine essence. And that was the argument against the Arians. The Arians essentially thought that Athanasius and Basil and Augustine and these other defenders of the Trinity, they thought they were social Trinitarians. And so their whole thing was to clarify, no, we're not social Trinitarians. And then this actually gets brought up again in the monothelite controversy. Because in the monothelite controversy,
one will in Christ, only one will in Christ.
Yeah, the monothelites said there was one will in Christ, because Christ is a person, he must have a singular will. If you said there are two wills, you would end up then in Nestorianism. But what Maximus clarifies, he says, no, right, the whole reason that the three persons of the Trinity are not three separate beings, the reason that there's still one singular divine being, in part, they share one singular nature, which has one singular will to it, right? This is how we know they're all of one nature, because they always will and act the same way, which means they must have one will and one activity. Again, you're going back to your earlier question about activity. This is going to be, they have one singular odd extra activity and one singular odd extra will. And so, therefore, if Christ has two natures, human and divine, he must have a human and divine will, and he must have a human activity and a divine activity. This creates an issue because some earlier fathers spoke of Christ as having a theandric activity, a divine human activity. And Maximus says we can speak of that because there's who is acting as a human and as God. It's one singular person. But he pulls up a great passage in St. Gregory Nazianzen where he goes, Christ walked as a human, but he walked on water as God. Right? He fed people as a human, but he broke the loaf into infinite pieces as God, right? That he was able. We see Christ in the Gospels doing both human and divine things that are distinct. So he must have a distinct human activity and a divine activity, right? So I think really if the social Trinitarians are correct, first of all, it means the Arians were correct in most of their arguments against us. But secondly, I think it's because actually a lot of the social Trinitarians are really just Arians themselves, so that they can avoid the exact errors of polytheism they're wishing to avoid. And they're going to end up denying essentially Chalcedonian Christology.
Yeah, you said something that was going to give me a follow-up question. You were talking about I can't remember my follow-up question now because you just every part of every sentence you say has a million fascinating tangents that I want to go down. But yeah. I want to talk a little bit, I guess, about the accidents, because in this article it said that some people were saying, the saints were saying that God doesn't have accidents, and then later in the article it said that the persons themselves are accidental. Can you just talk about and tell me what does the church teach about God and accidents? Are there any accidents? Yeah. I know Jesus Christ in his human nature has plenty of accidents, right?
Yeah. So we're saying essentially, that God does not have any accidents, because accidents are something that could be some other way, and there's nothing in God that could be some other way, right? God is infinitely perfect. What God is essential to him, versus us, right? If I put on a different shirt, I would be the same person. That's not essential to me. But God, it's not like he has a shirt on that he could then exchange for another shirt. Now, Christ's human body, right, which is part of his human nature, that has plenty of accidents to it. That can change in many ways. But God is not an accident. Now, some saints, when they're trying to describe the relationship between natures and persons, use the analogy of accidents in essence, of an accident inhering in an essence. A number of saints, when they're trying to describe the relationship of how can Christ have both a human and divine nature, they use the analogy of how multiple accidents can inhere in a single essence. And so two natures could inhere in a single person.
I see.
But they're not saying that Christ's natures are actually accidental to him. It's an analogy. And I actually got into a long discussion on a Discord voice chat with a convert to Coptic Christianity. So he denies that Christ has two natures. And he was using exactly this argument. He was concerned that we are making Christ's natures only accidental to him.
I just remembered the thing that I was trying to remember before, which is the communication of idioms, right? I just want you to talk about it and talk about how, because I heard you sort of being careful to attribute the human to the human nature and the divine to the divine nature. And of course, this is only natural. We would want to be careful about that, right? But yeah. What is this communication of idioms? I've read about it in here and I understood what I read, but I'm just not I don't quite grasp it. Is it just that, just making sure we keep the human with the human, divine with the divine, or what is it?
Well, the communication of idioms is essentially, right, whatever is proper to that nature is proper to that person. So we're saying essentially that anything that can be said of the divine nature or of the human nature can be said of Christ, right? So we can say, for example, the Son, right, the second person of the Trinity, died on the cross because he is the human nature. And so when when he dies, right, human nature can't die. He dies in his human nature, right? I'm gonna pull up a specific passage here.
Are there dangers? Are
Um,
there dangers in the
yeah,
communication of idiom?
yeah. So it's saying, First Corinthians 2:8 says, none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So the scriptures say they crucified the Lord of glory, right? They crucified God. But how can God be crucified? Well, it's because the Christ was crucified, right? So humans can be crucified. Christ is a human. Therefore, Christ can be crucified. Christ is God. So when Christ was crucified, God was crucified. That's essentially the steps we are walking through with the communication of idioms. Now, again, we are, as you're saying, we're speaking in a human manner, right? Because properly speaking, as God, he cannot die. But as a human, he can die. And there's not two persons. There's not one, a human person that dies and a divine person that goes on living. There's a singular person that dies. And that's essentially what Pope St. Leo the Great is trying to get at when he discusses the communication of idioms in the Tome of Leo.
Okay, that's a good exposition of that teaching. Is it wrong to say the second person of the Divine Trinity was crucified? Is that wrong?
No, that's not wrong to say. You can say that he was crucified.
Okay.
Now, he was crucified, right, because he had a human nature. So before the incarnation, he could not have been crucified. Because he didn't have a human nature to be. God cannot be crucified, right?
Yeah. This reminds me. Oh yeah. Well, I was also going to just mention an offhand way. Of course, the Theotokos, the Mother of God. That's relying on the exact same logic, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's all been hammered out. Like this has all been hammered out long, long ago.
Yeah, because we have to ask what we mean when we say God, right? So when we say God, we could be speaking of the divine nature, or we could be speaking about one person. So we say God was crucified or God was born. We are speaking only of the second person of the Trinity. Versus if we say God has an intellect and a will, we are speaking there of the divine essence of all three persons.
I'm happy to be exploring this question, but I'm still a little bit uncomfortable with this whole add extra thing. I mean, I believe it. I fully believe it, but it does put me in an awkward situation because I think about the freedom that Christ had. Because it's another dogma that I discovered in this book and elsewhere, that everything that happens ad extra is freely done by God, but everything that happens in the life of the Trinity is done of necessity. For example, God loves us freely, but he loves himself of necessity. You agree with that, right?
Yeah.
And you understand how I would be a little bit uncomfortable now looking at the free choices made by the God-man Jesus Christ on earth, and how every one of those free choices has to be ad extra, and therefore it has to be an activity of all three persons, right?
Yeah, I think going back to that, right, that there's one will within God, and that will is a free will. I think Scotus expresses that very well, where Scotus essentially argues that rationality in humans, we can speak of the intellect as rational, but he says true rationality really is the ability to freely choose between alternatives, that you're not constrained at all.
All right.
And he says God as the rationality is a pure perfection. And so God is the maximally or the infinitely rational being, is able then to more freely than even is conceivable to a human mind choose between alternatives. But we're saying, right, it's not as though Christ willed to do one thing and the Father willed to do another thing. It's that there's always going to be a unity in willing.
And when he said, "Not my will be done, but your will be done," that was an example for us of how to conform as he conformed.
Because Christ had two natures. I think he's saying in his human nature, not my will be done, but thy will be done, as an example for how our human nature should conform. As Maximus talks about how part of the reason Christ had to have a human will and a human activity is so that he as God could communicate divinity to every activity. He participated within every possible human activity and communicated divinity to that. So when we become united with him, we receive his divinity into our activities.
It reminds me of the baptism in the Jordan and how we benefit from that the change
Yeah.
that the water underwent at the baptism. I forget who, it was a recent scholar who pointed that out to me. Might have been Scott Hahn, but it's a beautiful idea. And you know, as an atheist or an enemy of Christ in the church, you might ask, well, why? And even St. John the Baptist asked, like, why do you need to be baptized? Right? It's a natural question. It's a good question, right? Why does the God-man need to be baptized? But it's for our benefit. And those waters, like, I'm drinking water right now. This is like, I'm right there with Jesus in the Jordan. Like, this is transformed by his baptism. No? Do you see it that way?
Yeah. If you actually look at an icon for the baptism of Christ, you will see his arms outstretched over the water like a priest does when they're blessing the waters before a baptism. Because when we're baptized, we're blessed and brought into Christ. But when Christ was baptized, he was actually creating baptism. He was the one blessing the waters in that baptism so that we could be baptized with that water.
Wow. And when St. John asked the question from jail, are you the one? How do you read that psychologically? Don't disparage my hero, St. John the Baptist.
Yeah. No, I think it's St. John. I mean, right, I think Christ, if we just immediately accepted Christ and we didn't even think about it at all, that might not actually be better than having to think about it, right? It might be that God wanted St. John to have to think about it for a little bit to make sure he's coming to the correct conclusion, because Christ says, right, a house built on sand is going to wash away when the waters come in. Right? We need to be able to think about it and have serious thought about it, because otherwise, right? Imagine if you you see these kids who grow up in very sheltered Christian homes, and they go off into the world, and they usually become atheists within a few months because they never encountered objections to the faith before, and now they encounter objections and they have no answer. And then they first just get annoyed, but it happening over and over. It's eventually going to make an impression on you, and eventually it's going to start making you skeptical of the faith, no matter how strong you were before going in. And so I think that that's a very important thing.
I've got a commenter on my YouTube channel. He keeps hounding me with the same question about, well, I've got two of them. I guess I'll talk about the evolution creation one.
Yeah.
He seems to think that the magisterial weight is on the side of evolution. I said, no, we've got quantity and quality on our side. Can you just back me up on that?
Yeah, actually, I have just gotten involved with a new ministry. We have a blog now called creationtheologyfellowship.org.
Send me the link, please.
Yeah, we're going to be having a lot of very good stuff coming out from there. So far, we have 2 articles up. I wrote one argument, just a scriptural argument for why you should read it, the passages literally. And then we also got a submission just today, which I posted up, from Louis Gideon, who's an up-and-coming biblical scholar, on the Hebrew grammar of Genesis 2 and whether or not it contradicts Genesis 1. Because there's a passage, when I first read the objection, it was actually a lot more intelligent than I expected it to be. Actually, I didn't find this from an atheist. As I was trying to rebut the more simple objection, came across the more intelligent one myself and having an issue. Because I was wondering, all right, it says that the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven were formed because Adam couldn't find a partner. And I'm thinking, all right, well, they just had been formed earlier, and God could have done it out of order. But when I went to the Hebrew and read it, and I checked the tense of the verb for formed, and it's a sequential imperfect, which means it happens chronologically.
Okay.
It's a special tense in Hebrew that does not appear in most languages, which actually strongly implies chronology, at least according to the basic entry. And I said, oh, shoot, this is saying essentially here a very strong contradiction with Genesis 1, where maybe you could say Genesis 1 isn't chronological on each day, and the beasts of the land could have been made earlier. But what about the birds of the heaven? We know they were made a day before. But so I went and I contacted a few different Hebrew scholars, and Louis Gideon got back to me first, so his article got up there. They all said the same thing to me, where they brought up a number of different actual scholarly books on Hebrew grammar, saying that actually sometimes the sequential imperfect is a sequence of intention or thought rather than a sequence of time. And so it actually could be translated as a pluperfect. And they actually show a number of times where it's quite obvious in the context the sequential imperfect is meant to be taken as a pluperfect. And so But the context here, usually it does mean temporally. But if the context dictates it should be taken as a pluperfect, then there's plenty of other examples in Hebrew of that being the case. So we have a great article on that. And we have a lot of other great stuff coming up, including some magisterial stuff. And actually, if you go to our website and sign up for our mailing list, type in your name and your email and check the little box and then click on it. It will give you a link, and also email. If you'd missed that link, it'll email it to your email as well. And click on that link, and it will give you a 35-page ebook showing that the Fourth Lateran Council taught creation.
Yeah, that's the one Hugh Owen always emphasizes. And
this book was authored by Hugh Owen and 2 other guys, and it has a whole list of endorsements in the front, including from a bishop and for a number of theologians as well. So we have that up there for free, which you can get if you go. It says that God made all things which could be taken literally sort of simultaneously, but within the larger context of scholastic theology, this was frequently a word used to describe the work of the 6 days, made together at a very close amount of time, and that it would be sort of stretching the meaning of the word to say that simul here means 14 billion years,
What last time when I had you on my show, I said, "Hey, what do you think of Kent Hovind?" I meant to say Hugh Owen, but I said Kent Hovind by accident.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But so I mean, Hugh Owen, he's a sweet, generous, loving man. Nice big family, and he's been very kind and generous with me over the years. He's been on my podcast a couple of times. He's not an academically trained scholar or anything like that, is he?
No, I don't think he is, but he's a great guy. I've met him twice so far. We've also corresponded over email quite a bit. Yeah,
you met in real life?
Yeah, you met in real life. I actually bumped into him once at a divine liturgy because I had known he sometimes attended this parish, which I would also attend infrequently because it was a significant drive from my house. They had a beautiful divine liturgy. And I'm there and I'm thinking, that looks like Hugh Owen. I think he goes to this parish also, but I don't want to just confront him. So I quickly run out after the dismissal, Google him and make sure I get the picture right. And I'm like, yeah, that looks like him. And we went up and met afterwards. And then actually just a few months ago, a friend of mine calls me up and is like, hey, like a week before Easter, there's going to be a Colby Center conference in Virginia. Like a bunch of, I used to live in DC. Now I live out in Seattle. And the guys in DC, a bunch of my friends were going to go out to him. I was like, oh, I'm actually flying out to DC, but I'm like showing up like a day late to miss the conference. I went and rebooked my flight 2 days earlier. And we went out there and I got to meet him a second time.
Oh, that's so amazing. I got to meet Kevin Mark, who's the Canadian guy.
Yeah, he and I, he was at the conference. We didn't get to meet afterwards because I ran off a little bit early to try and dodge the traffic home. But we talked afterwards over email, and even was nice and sent me a book and everything.
Nice guy, a beautiful big family, amazing. It's amazing. Warms the cockles of my heart. Like it's just like so. It's such a powerful testimony to Christ and the church. I think a nice big family.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit concerned. He seems to be going SSPX, and he's moved to the States. He's attending SSPX, and I'm a bit worried about him because I don't agree with SSPX because they oppose Vatican II. And
yeah, I agree. Yeah, and we actually at this new Creation Theology Fellowship, we actually want to do some work related to Vatican II. I actually quote De Verbum in my article I put out there. And we're planning to also do some work on what Pope Francis talks about on creation and Laudato Si.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
What did he say? Because I read it, but I don't recall.
No, actually, so I'm planning, I know he talks about it there. I'm planning to dig into it. And I was just like, I'll read it quickly. And then I see it's 184 pages. And I'm like, all right, I need to dedicate like 2 or 3 days to like reading it and taking notes. But I know he gets into quite a bit of Bonaventure there, which I'm very interested in. So.
Wow.
And we don't want to, have it as like, all right, we're trying to do something like opposing the church. Our little subheading there, if you go to our website, is to serve the servants of God through creation theology, which is an allusion to the title of the Pope, which is servant to the servants of God. So we were saying, all right, there's also the servants of God as the priests, who are the servants of God. And we're here as this lay minister. And we're not actually even just a lay minister. We have lots and lots of priests associated with them. And the thing is, a lot of them don't want the backlash. I'm going to a conference that we're hosting in about a little over a month. There's like a dozen priests going there. And a lot of them, I don't want to dox their names or anything like that, get them in trouble or say where or when the conference is. because a lot of them are worried about the backlash they're going to get. So a lot of what we want to do is work with priests, not against the hierarchy or anything, and try and create a better resources for academics and especially for the clergy, so that hopefully maybe 100 years down the line there's a council on this issue, and
Yeah.
that we will have helped provided some of the resources there that they can draw from. That's our hope, is that God can work
Wow.
through us to do that. And so
Wow. 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 So amazing. You know, I've been accused of being an ultramontanist, and I thought that was a condemned heresy, but since I've been cozying up to Nick Fuentes and his Groypers and all that, that movement of young Catholic men who are, you know, admittedly very edgy
yeah.
and say a lot of racy things, no pun intended. But there's something good in there, you know, there's some good stuff in there. They embrace the label ultramontanist, and I in a way I like that, because it's just loyalty to the living magisterium, which is essential, right? Just tell me historically, what is ultramontanism? Has it been condemned, or can I call myself an ultramontanist? I wouldn't do that because I'm just a Catholic. But is it condemned or not?
No, it's not condemned. And really, historically, when the word first came up, it was sort of like just the Catholic position. Now, I think there are some people who took it too far, because essentially what was going on in France, and starting in around the 1700s, and especially really heating up in the 1800s, the French Revolution and so on, is that there were two groups. There were the Gallicans and the Ultramontanists. The Gallicans, harkening back to the Gaul, the name of the Roman province of France. And the Gallicans said essentially the French Catholic Church is a French Catholic Church.
National.
Right. So it gets to run itself. It's in communion with the Pope, and the Pope's still the head of theology. But in terms of its actual affairs, it gets to run itself. The Pope doesn't get to tell us what to do, and the King is not subject to the Pope. The King is in charge of the French Catholic Church, not the Pope. Versus the Ultramontanists, Montes is the Latin word for mountains. So the Ultramontanists are the ones who looked over the Alps Mountains to Rome, and saw the Pope as the authority over the French Catholic Church. So that's the origin of the word. Now, some people might have taken it too far, right? There are people who seem to imply, especially in the wake of sort of the spirit of Vatican I. There are people who act like the Pope can never make a mistake, the Pope can never commit a sin, like the Pope always has to be, even if they don't necessarily commit a sin, they always have to be a morally upright person. We know through history these things are not true. But that's essentially, every time you have a error, there's always going to be some people who are going to go too far in rejecting the error. But I think overall that Ultramontanism was the Catholic position. It essentially meant that the Catholic Church, both in its theological and temporal affairs, is under the authority of the Pope.
One of my friends is a little bit of a rad trad, and when he criticizes Pope Francis, which he's done many times, I find it distasteful. And he says, well, look, St. Paul criticized St. Peter. And my immediate response is, you're no St. Paul. Sorry, you're not in the role of St. Paul to St. Peter. You're just not in that role. It's just nowhere close, not even close, right? Do you back me up on that?
Yeah, and I also think that we have to do it in a correct spirit, right? So if our spirit is the fraternal correction of the Pope, I mean, really, even there, that's not our duty to do so, right?
No.
I think that's the duty of someone like a cardinal, or even if they are a layperson. Catherine of Siena was a layperson, but she was very close to the Pope personally. And so you have to be, right, I think, in the right position. That God gives different people different stations in life. Now, do you have to agree with everything the Pope did? No, I think the Pope's recent approach to the Latin Mass has been quite problematic. And a lot of local bishops have been resisting that and allowing people to continue the Latin Mass. And I think if your bishop's saying you can keep doing the Latin Mass, then absolutely go ahead, right? You're under the authority of your bishop on that matter until the Pope intervenes. But it's then the job of that bishop then to go back to the Pope and say, I think that was an unwise decision. That should be changed.
And Vatican II pushes Latin, it pushes Gregorian chant, it pushes the organ, it pushes everything that's traditional, and it just allows for certain responsorial parts to be in the colloquial local language, right?
Yeah.
So it's obviously been like the needle's been pushed by that spirit of Vatican II so far. And the Mother Church is very accommodating and gentle and patient. So Mother Church is allowing these abuses, and there are many abuses, but Mother Church is allowing them very patiently and just going to gently bring us back on course. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think so. That essentially you have to remember that God's ultimately in control of the church, right? And there are bad times, but I think, right, God chastises the church sometimes where we're doing bad things, but the Holy Spirit will never abandon the church.
So next time I'm at a clown mass, I'll just say, don't resist Babylon. Go join Babylon. Join Babylon. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Of course.
So that's actually something that I think really needs to be done right now, is research on that period in history with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and how much of it even corresponds to now, right? Because there were also many differences at that time. The Holy Spirit had not been given to the church yet, right? The prophets had the Holy Spirit, but as a whole, the church had not been given the Holy Spirit. And so we have to factor that in. I think that there really needs to be biblical scholars, I think, need to undertake to study that period to see how it applies to today and how we can get wisdom from it.
Is there any history chronological dating where you would be comfortable like having a poster, a big poster on your wall, and it says, this is roughly when Adam and Eve were created in paradise. This is roughly when this biblical Old Testament thing happened. This is roughly when that happened.
Yeah.
Is there a version of that? And I've seen many versions of them online. I even have a poster.
Yeah.
But is there any version of that, hypothetically, where you could put it on your wall and you'd say, I'm 99% sure this is what the timeline is of human salvation history?
Maybe. I think I've seen enough good arguments on multiple sides at quite a number of different spots in biblical chronology that I'm saying, all right, I think I'm going to really leave. My mind can't work with chronology well enough to really say that. Like, my mind starts getting jumbled with the numbers. So I'm going to leave that really. I think there needs to be historians who are serious historians who also seriously believe the authority of the Bible to really work on that. And I think especially reconstructing the period of the kings, because that work was done by Edwin Thiele, and he was a very good scholar, but he was generally accepting, from what I understand, the secular chronology of Assyria at that time and trying to reconcile the two. Whereas Martin Anstey, from what I understand, rejected that period and ended up with about 50 more years than Edwin Thiele did. So that's a really good question. I think we need to investigate on the Bible's own terms who is correct on that, because when Anstey I think it's Anstey or Anstey or something like that, added up the years, he actually found quite a number of gaps within it, which he argues are interregna, periods between the kings. And once you start adding that in, you start realizing, oh shoot, there were regularly 10 or 20 years without kings. This is why there's so much chaos going on, because there are constantly, the Book of Kings records so many civil wars, both in the northern and southern kingdom. And those are apparently only the ones we get that are important enough to record. If Anstey is correct in his chronology, there probably are like a dozen more that don't even make it into the text. And there's lots of other things. Like, I've been trying desperately to find good resources on the Egyptian, Assyrian, like Babylonian wars. There seems to be this three-way war going on between Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon that shows up as very important in the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah. It's referenced quite a bit, especially the battles of Megiddo and Carchemish. And I can't find good enough resources. Like, there's not even a Wikipedia page on this war. There's a Wikipedia page only on the two battles that appear in the Bible. And it could just genuinely be that our few biblical records of it are pretty much the only records we have of this war. And so historians don't know how to reconstruct it well. But I think a lot of that work needs to be done, or I have yet to find good resources on it. David Roll, who's he's actually an agnostic, but he's doing a lot of work trying to reconstruct biblical chronology, and he's actually become convinced that the biblical chronology is very right and secular historians are very, very wrong, despite him being an agnostic. And he's sort of been exiled from the academy for this. And I don't know if his revised chronology is actually entirely correct. I have seen very good criticisms of his work as well. David Falk's a guy on YouTube who's put out some very detailed critiques of Roll's work, and Falk is actually a Christian who does believe in biblical authority. So it could well be that Roll is totally wrong. But Roll is he wrote mainly on Egypt originally, but he's been doing a 2-volume work on the history of Israel in specific. And the first volume came out, and the second volume is coming out whenever he finishes it, which might be quite a number of years. I think he said he's half done writing it. And so hopefully we'll get the answers to some of these questions in his book, or at least I'm hoping he'll help clarify some of this.
I listened to a really entertaining Catholic, sort of a conservative academic Catholic scholar guy, professor. You would know his name if I said it, I just can't remember it. Really entertaining guy. But he did a talk about, I don't know if the talk was about creationism or not, but he actually pulled up documents from the liturgy, like sort of the calendar of the church, and how certain times of the year there was a festival or whatever it was. I don't know what it was, but they would always, maybe it was Christmas, I don't know, but they would talk about creation and what day of the week it was, what time it was, and all this sorts of things. And it was at that time, X thousand number of years ago, that Adam and Eve were created. And he cited this as very strong documentary evidence that the church always believed in young earth creationism. And I wish I had taken note of what this document is, or what the feast was. I think it was Christmas.
Oh, yeah, it's on Christmas, yeah. Yeah, so it's actually, if you go to the one the Vatican puts out now, or at least it's not the one the Vatican puts out, it's the one I think the USCCB puts out, they edited out all the dates.
Oh.
The one read at most churches now on Christmas edits out all the dates. It says like many ages ago, and then many ages later.
Oh no!
And then only around Moses starts giving dates.
Oh, why did they do that?
I don't know. Yeah, and I'm not saying that this chronology given to us is necessarily 100% correct, but I think that it's a good signpost of that the church did hold this as a real chronology of history.
Okay, in the Eastern churches and the Orthodox churches, I'm very curious, do they embrace Darwinianism and evolution and all that crap?
A lot of their seminaries do, but actually many of their recent saints have condemned it as a heresy.
Seraphim Rose and all those people?
Yeah, Seraphim Rose, Elder Paisios, who they've canonized.
Yeah.
He actually went on a whole rant at one point where he's saying, are you going to say the Theotokos is descended from an ape?
Yeah. Yeah, period. End of controversy right there. Boom.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Not only descended from an ape, but an ape herself. Like that is what the theory of evolution teaches. She is an ape. I'm not saying she's an ape, but they're saying she's an ape. So what about the Nephilim? I don't want to keep you because I will have to let you go here soon. But what about the Nephilim? What about the giants and the Nephilim and the line of Cain, the line of Seth? Can you just sort of outline that for me? Because actually, my wife, she's agnostic, but she was asking me about the Nephilim.
Yeah, I actually did a video on the Nephilim, sort of my 2 cents on it, because I think it is a very complex issue. So sort of 2 theories, right? There's they were demonic offspring theory, that essentially humans and demons interbred and created these giants.
I don't like that.
And there's another theory that, what is it? That essentially this is the line of Seth and the line of Cain getting married. Now, that one works better metaphysically, but I think just textually, it doesn't really work. That sons of God much more frequently in the Pentateuch. Later on, it does refer to the people of God, but in the Pentateuch, I think pretty much every passage I could find, it refers to angels. And this passage, like, why would there be giants produced from intermarriage? And also, this would go against the scriptural account that intermarriage in itself is not wrong. It's intermarrying with the unrighteous that is wrong, right? Intermarrying with the convert isn't an issue. And so why, if these were converted Cainites who they were marrying, then that would have not have been an issue. If they were marrying them, then they were falling into idolatry already. That's it's its own separate issue.
But the demons cannot take on flesh. That's a fact.
Yeah, and that's the issue. Yeah. One good explanation I've seen actually is if you look in a lot of ancient cultures, they have what they would call sort of a ritual intermarriage, where they would have temple priestesses, and they would essentially have sexual relations with the temple priests that would then be connected to prayers that would involve essentially a sort of possession by the god, where the priest comes to represent the god.
I see.
And so I think this is going on, that these are essentially children who are offered up to these demonic gods. And so if they were, we know that demonic possession can cause physical deformity or superhuman strength and stuff. Now imagine if they were possessed from the moment of birth. They might be like giants. I think that these are, Yeah, from the moment of conception, right? And so I think these are real giants that are produced through something like this. And I think it's probably, if you notice, the Cainites and the Sethites, or the Cainites rather, they last 7 generations from Cain, versus the Sethites last 10 generations. Well, I think this is because in that 7th generation, the Sethites turn against God, produce the Nephilim, and use them to conquer the Cainites. Because the Cainites no longer exist at this point; they are conquered. And the 7th person is Jared. I think that's his name, if I remember correctly. Now, most of them, right? We have the line of firstborn sons going down. I think this is a succession of kings from Seth in the Sethite area of the world, right outside the garden. We have a succession. I think it's about at 60 years the firstborn son is born. So I think this is a succession of kings. But Enoch is born, I think, at around like 165 or so. Probably a number of kids later than normally. So I think Enoch is not his firstborn son. Now, I think Enoch, right? We see in here we go. Let me pull up in the book of Jude. Where did I put my Bible down? Yeah, here we go. Pull up in my Bible. We don't have any recorded sayings of Enoch himself. We have a book of Enoch.
Yeah.
But the book of Enoch we have now is probably a jumble of both real and fake stuff. Yeah. So I don't think it in itself is trustworthy. It probably didn't even, a lot of people point out that Jude quotes it, but we don't even know if it existed in its current form at the time of the New Testament. So it could be very well that it's quoting Jude. We really don't know, or they're quoting a common source. But here we go. See if I can find. Yeah, Jude verse 14. It was these also that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam, the 7th generation here, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with myriad of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness, which they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." And I actually think Jude is writing his letter shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem, warning of the judgment that's about to come on Jerusalem. So I think in the same way, Enoch was there to prophesy against the house of Jared and prophesy essentially, if you're doing this, you're turning away from God, God will destroy you. 3 generations later, right? God destroys it. And we see, what is it say in the second half of the first commandment? Here we go. Let me pull up Exodus 20 here, so I can quote it in full. All right. Here we go. You shall not make for yourself any graven image of any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or anything on the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Right? So don't make idols, because I'm a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children, to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me. Right? So God, generally, when there's a corporate act of apostasy, God doesn't usually destroy that generation. He says, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the sons, to the 3rd and the 4th generation. God usually gives them about 3 or 4 generations and then goes and destroys them. So God gives them another 3 or 4 generations after Jared to repent, and they don't repent. So God sends the flood and destroys them.
Is the flood, does it introduce chronological issues if you take it literally, as you and I do, that only 8 people survived? Like the long lifespans of Noah's father and grandfather, they would have been still alive, right, at the time of the flood?
Yeah, I think he's I think it's his father dies before, but I think his grandfather is still alive and actually dies in the year of the flood.
Okay, but Methuselah would have been a couple of generations
like 900
before.
Something, yeah. And there's sort of a debate in the tradition of did he die in the flood because he was actually evil and he died, or essentially that he was so old, essentially he's just not going to go, right? We don't really know. We don't know anything about Methuselah's life, whether or not he was a good guy. But we know everyone else in that line was righteous, so I'm guessing he probably was a good guy, and then just since he was either too old or died shortly before the flood. I know it's in that like Russell Crowe version of Noah. They have him passing away like moments before the flood is going to happen.
Cool.
I'm not endorsing that as canonical, but
Yeah.
that to me makes sense in that one detail of the movie. But what's interesting is we see giants again after the flood.
Yeah.
So I think that this same sort of ritual intermarriage happened after the flood,
Yeah.
and this is why giants were very frequent throughout the ancient world. And maybe this still exists today, or maybe the coming of Christ put an end to it. I don't know which one of those it is. Like, I guess we'll see if there's any giants around.
Yeah, yeah.
I do know, I heard one theory for a little while. I don't know if this is true or not, that Peter the Great of Russia, who I consider one of the villains of history, he was unusually large. So that's all I'll put out there.
It's fascinating stuff. Really appreciate you having me on the show, man. I'm gonna have to wrap it up here. But what were you just about to say now?
Yeah, I was gonna say, this is just my speculation about the Nephilim. Like, there's no dogmatic teaching of the church on this, so people can feel free to disagree with me on this as much as you want. This is just my theory on it.
It's gonna be beautiful on Judgment Day, if we make it to heaven. On Judgment Day, to see, or maybe throughout the course of our stay in heaven, maybe that's when we're gonna see the Bible stories in their full depth and detail. And I think we'll be surprised to see the overlap of some of the stories and the chronology of some of these stories. And I think it's just common sense to humbly admit that we're wrong about a lot of the chronology and a lot of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think if you notice it, the Bible is very good at relative chronology. Like, when you're looking at one person's life, you can usually get enough details to figure everything out. It's figuring out long distances of time. And I think that's because that's not the exact number of years between significant events aren't important unless the Bible tends to give us a number telling us why it's important. Like 480 years from the Exodus, the building of the temple. Because, right, Dave Verboom says that God committed everything to Scripture, which is necessary for our salvation. So God committed exactly, right? The Holy Spirit, I think, doesn't waste his breath. God committed exactly the right number of words to the Bible that are necessary for us to know all Catholic doctrine. All Catholic doctrine is communicated in exactly the right number of words to do that. Now, there are lots of other details that help us understand the stories, help us better understand history, but they're not the Bible story. And that's also another important thing to remember. We don't want to confuse our interpretations of the Bible with the Bible. That the Bible gives us a story, and we can really easily in our mind have an interpretation of it that we then treat as the Bible. And if it turns out that version of the story in our head is wrong, we start having a crisis of faith. We need to be careful to distinguish the two. And
because our faith is in ourselves ultimately.
Yeah.
And our genius intellects. But you were talking about the Bible, the chronology. You brought up an interesting point that I want to touch on here. If I can only remember what you were talking about there. Just give me 1 moment, because there was an important question I wanted to ask you about this. It'll probably come to me. But we'll definitely talk again. Yeah. And I do have to run now, but I really appreciate you having me on. It's a joy. It's just a real joy to talk to you and listen to you.
Thank you.
And I did want to ask you very, very briefly, are you aware of the dangers of getting obsessed with the academic questions? Are you consciously aware of that and fighting that? Like you said early on in this talk about the young child and the innocence she brings to a simple simple insight. Are you aware that it could be tantalizing to go down a rabbit trail because we are just given what we need out of the Bible, and we're not supposed to go beyond what we need, right? That's a form of hubris, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And assuming that we have all the answers now, right? There's, one of my favorite creation scientists is a guy named Todd Wood. And he has a great story of him. He read a bunch of books on, he's a biologist. He doesn't focus on geology. So he read a bunch of books on how the flood works, thought he understood it well. Then was reading an article about dinosaur nests. And it seems from the fossil record that there are cases where there was a dinosaur nest that was abandoned for a significant amount of time, partially fossilized, then was used again by a dinosaur. And he said, all right, how does the flood happen, bury it? the flood goes away, a dinosaur comes back, lives there for a little while, then the flood comes again. And he says a lot of people at that point would have said, all right, I can't believe the flood anymore because I don't have the answer to how that works. And he just goes, maybe I don't understand the flood right. Like those books that creationists have work to do, they probably are still right on the overall framework of the flood, but there's probably a lot of details that worked out at the moment that we don't fully understand. If you actually go back to the text, it mentions it took 150 days for the waters to prevail in the flood. That's a significant amount of time for stuff to be happening before the world is actually fully flooded, right? So he just went, I don't understand the flood. And he said, 25 years later, I still don't understand the flood, but I understand a lot more than I did back then, right? That we have to simply sit back and let God reveal things. As maybe in my lifetime, we won't ever figure out fully how this detail happened during the flood. But I trust with time, God will give us the answer when it's right.
I remembered the thing I was listening when it came to me as you were talking. The thing I wanted to just touch on very briefly was the numerology of the Bible. You see the Jews with their alphabet, with the numerical values of each letter, and there are movies made about this and the significance of numerology. And then you have astrology, like the meaning of what the heavens, the shapes of the heavens, all these things. In my Catholic understanding, everything is well ordered and everything has meaning and everything is ordered to our salvation and everything is good. Numbers are good, numbers have meaning, letters are good, letters have meaning, the stars and the shapes and everything is meaningful. So I think on Judgment Day and thereafter in heaven, we're going to understand the numerology of the Bible. Isn't that going to be exciting? And the funny thing is, even palm reading, God can do a palm reading. It's not a blasphemous thing. God can do he can do all these he can do all the new age junk, which is demonic now, because it's not appropriate now for us to be peering in and like raising Samuel to talk to Samuel or whatever, right?
Yeah, because I think numerology very frequently turns into this is what I feel like the numbers mean, and it's not well grounded. But I think if we're looking, because there are plenty of numbers that are clear. Like there's actually one point where Jesus performs some miracle involving numbers. I can't remember what it is, and the apostles don't understand what it means, and Jesus rebukes them for not understanding the meaning of the numbers there, because they should have studied their Old Testament and known what these numbers meant. And so I think it's good to try and peer into what those numbers mean, but it has to be grounded in something. It can't be just pure speculation. It has to be, all right, here's lots of biblical stories that use this number. Here's the common theme they have. All right, let's see if bringing that number related to that insight actually helps us better understand the stories. And if it does, I think that's good confirmation we're onto something. But if it doesn't help us understand it, then it's probably not right. Or if it's just pure idle speculation.
When I read the Bible, and I listen to the Bible, I don't read it, like I don't spend a lot of time physically reading the Bible with my eyeballs. I listen to the Bible. I think that's a nice way to digest it. I've sort of taken on the habit of just letting it wash over me. And I got this analogy, like this way of looking at the incomprehensible parts of the Bible, what's incomprehensible to me right now anyway, a lot of the Old Testament especially. I've taken on the habit of saying it's like a trailer video for a movie. Like heaven is the movie and the Bible is a series of trailers for the actual movie. And when we get to Judgment Day and heaven, that's when you see the movie. That's when so there's some spoiler alerts in the Bible for sure. For sure. Spoiler alert. we know the outcome for Satan, right? We already know. Yeah. So just like in a good trailer, we know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. We know who wins in the end. But the spoilers are just well balanced. And the other aspect is that we live in a fallen world and just there's going to be some confusion. I think you admitted that much too, right?
No, I agree, yeah.
Do you like my spoiler alert idea with the trailer?
No, I do, yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on again. I'd love to talk some more, and I hope we'll talk again. I hope you come back on my podcast, and we'll get some talking points to dig deep into some of your favorite topics. Okay?
I think that sounds good. Yeah. Talk to you soon, David.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
God bless.
Bye.